It started with a car wash. A grubby little gas station in the Brazilian capital watched for laundering dirty cash. From that one thread, investigators pulled on the biggest corruption scandal the world had ever seen.
A state oil giant, the pride of a nation, hollowed out from the inside.
Billions in bribes. A cartel of the country's biggest builders. Politicians, ministers, a president. This is the story of Petrobras and Operation Car Wash. How a crusade exposed a continent's corruption, and how that same crusade, in the end, broke its own rules. Quick note before we begin.
To understand the scandal, you first have to understand the company. Petrobras was Brazil's state-controlled oil company, founded in the 1950s. For decades, it was a symbol of national pride and independence. Its refineries and platforms were the muscle of the economy.
Then, in the 2000s, came a discovery that electrified the country.
Vast new oil reserves, trapped deep beneath the ocean floor. Brazil, it was said, was destined to become an energy superpower. Petrobras stock soared. The future looked golden. To build all that oil infrastructure, the company would spend tens of billions of dollars. Money on a scale that could change lives or be quietly stolen. Those giant contracts were supposed to be won by open, competitive bidding. Instead, a small group of the country's largest construction firms made a private arrangement.
Prosecutors would later call it a cartel. Insiders called it, simply, the club. The members agreed in advance who would win each tender.
They took turns, they rigged the prices, and they padded the bills. A project that should have cost $100 million might be billed at $110.
That extra slice was the grease that made the whole machine turn. Roughly 1 to 3% of each inflated contract was skimmed off the top. On tens of billions of dollars of work, those small percentages became a fortune.
And that fortune had to be shared with the men who let it happen. Corrupt directors inside Petrobras steered the contracts to the cartel.
In return, they were paid off. Again and again.
But you cannot just hand a powerful official a suitcase of cash and hope no one notices.
The bribes had to be hidden, laundered, made to look clean. That job fell to a network of black market money dealers known as doleiros.
They moved the money through fake consulting fees and phantom companies.
Through accounts in tax havens, far from Brazilian eyes.
One of those money dealers ran his operations partly through a humble business in Brasilia.
A gas station and car wash. In Portuguese, a lava jato.
In March 2014, federal police were watching it for ordinary money laundering.
They had no idea what they were about to uncover.
The operation took its name from that car wash. Operation Car Wash. A young team of prosecutors and a federal judge in the southern city of Curitiba led the charge. Their most powerful weapon was a tool called the plea bargain. Arrest one person. Offer them a lighter sentence if they name the next.
A money dealer named a Petrobras director. The director named more.
One of those early cooperators was a former Petrobras executive who agreed to talk.
His testimony cracked the case wide open. Suddenly, the investigators could see the whole machine. The cartel, the kickbacks, the politicians.
Wave after wave of arrests followed, each given a code name.
Construction bosses, executives, lobbyists, treasurers of political parties. Men once thought untouchable were led out in handcuffs, on live television. The country had never seen anything like it.
As the scheme came to light, Petrobras faced a terrible question.
How much of what was on its books was real, and how much was inflated by graft?
In April 2015, the company finally published audited accounts.
It admitted to roughly $2 billion in costs tied directly to corruption, and it wrote down its assets by an additional figure running into the billions. All told, the cleanup ran to something like $17 billion in write-downs. The share price had already collapsed. Ordinary Brazilians who owned the stock, directly or through their pensions, watched their savings shrink.
Because Petrobras shares also traded in New York, American regulators got involved. In 2018, the company settled with United States authorities.
It agreed to penalties and payments totaling around $1.8 billion.
Most of that money was ultimately directed back to Brazil.
Petrobras was, in a strange way, both a culprit and a victim of its own executives.
At the center of the cartel sat one company larger than all the rest. The construction conglomerate Odebrecht. Investigators discovered something almost beyond belief.
Odebrecht had built an entire secret department dedicated to paying bribes. It had its own staff, its own encrypted systems, even its own off-the-books bank. Bribery was not a side activity here. It was a line of business, run like an industry.
And it did not stop at Brazil's borders.
In 2016, Odebrecht admitted, in a landmark settlement, to a staggering scheme. It acknowledged paying hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes to officials and political parties across roughly a dozen countries in Latin America and beyond. The combined penalties reached around $3.5 billion. At the time, it was one of the largest foreign bribery cases in history. Odebrecht's chief executive was convicted and sentenced to 19 years in prison.
The sentence was later reduced when he too agreed to cooperate. Governments across the region wobbled as the names of those who took the money spilled out. Inside Brazil, the investigation climbed higher and higher. The judge leading it in Curitiba became a national celebrity. To millions, he was a fearless hero, finally holding the powerful to account. Then the case reached the most famous politician in the land.
A former president, once one of the most popular leaders in the world.
Prosecutors accused him of accepting a hidden benefit linked to the corruption scheme.
He denied it completely, calling the case a political persecution. In 2017, he was convicted by the judge in Curitiba. The following year, he was sent to prison, where he spent more than 500 days. His jailing split the country down the middle.
To some, it was proof that no one was above the law. To others, it was a stitch-up designed to remove him from politics. Both sides were about to be shaken by what came next.
In 2019, a news outlet published a trove of leaked private messages. They appeared to show the celebrated judge privately coaching the prosecutors,
advising the very team that was supposed to argue against the defense.
A judge is meant to be a neutral referee, not a player on one side.
The revelations cast a long shadow over the whole operation.
It did not help that the judge had since left the bench.
He had accepted a senior post as a minister in the new government, a political appointment.
Then, in 2021, the highest court in Brazil stepped in. The Supreme Court annulled the former president's convictions. It ruled that his cases had been heard in a court that had no jurisdiction over them. And in a separate, stinging decision, it ruled that the judge had been biased.
The former president walked free, his political rights restored.
He had always maintained his innocence, and the convictions against him were now wiped away. He went on to run for office again, and won, returning to the presidency. The task force that had once gripped the nation was quietly wound down. Years later, a United Nations Human Rights panel found his prosecution had violated fair trial guarantees.
So how do we make sense of Operation Car Wash?
It forces us to hold two difficult truths at the same time. First, the corruption it exposed was painfully real. A great national company was looted. A construction giant admitted to industrial-scale bribery.
Powerful men were convicted, and billions of dollars were eventually clawed back.
That theft was not invented. It happened, and it cost a nation dearly.
But the second truth is just as important.
The fight against corruption does not get to ignore the rules itself. When a judge takes sides, even against someone who may be guilty, the whole verdict is poisoned. Justice that bends the law to get its target stops being justice at all. Real corruption and a flawed crusade against it can both be true at once.
On the fraud terrain, we follow the money, and we weigh the evidence on every side. If this story gripped you, subscribe and tell us which case we should uncover next.